The day always began with the same sound, the sharp, insistent jingle of the bell hanging over the diner's door. It was a sound that signaled both arrival and departure, a constant rhythm in the small, greasy spoon world that had become her entire life. For Alara, it was the starting pistol. She moved from the small staff table in the back to the main floor, her worn-out sneakers making soft, sticky sounds on the linoleum that had been cleaned 1,000 times, but never felt truly clean. The air was a thick perfume of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint, chemical scent of bleach from the night before's mopping her uniform. A pale yellow dress that had faded with countless washes felt like a second skin. It was a little tight in the shoulders, a constant reminder of the long hours she spent hunched over tables. Her smile was the most important part of her uniform. She had practiced it in the mirror until it looked genuine, a gentle upturn of the lips that reached her eyes just enough to be convincing, but not so much that it gave away any of her own thoughts. It was a mask, and she wore it well. "Morning, Alara. The usual crowd today?" said the cook, a large, gruff man named Gus, who hid a soft heart under a permanently stained apron. He slid a plate of eggs and toast onto the warming station. The toast was slightly burnt, just the way the man in booth 3 liked it. "Got it, Gus," she said, her voice already shifting into its customer service tone, soft, patient, and always ready with a, "What can I get for you, hun?" The morning rush was a blur of motion. It was a dance she knew by heart. She weaved between tables, her arms laden with heavy plates, her mind a mental checklist of orders, refills, and checks. A coffee for the lady with the big red hat, side of ketchup for the kid in the high chair, the bill for the 2 businessmen who were always in a hurry. Her feet ached, a dull, persistent throb that started in her heels and shot up her legs. She thought about the thick, comfortable socks she'd seen in a store window, the ones with extra padding, and quickly did the math in her head. The cost was the same as 2 days' worth of her mother's medicine. The socks stayed in the window. Through it all, she was a quiet observer. She heard snippets of 100 different lives, a couple arguing quietly about money, Kaiser excitedly talking about a college acceptance, an old man sharing stories of a city that no longer existed. These stories were like tiny, invisible threads, and she collected them, storing them away in the back of her mind. They were the raw material for the music she kept locked inside. By late afternoon, the crowd thinned out. The bell jangled less frequently. The frantic energy of the morning gave way to a sleepy, heavy quiet. This was when the exhaustion really set in. It was a bone-deep weariness that made her shoulders slump and her smile feel heavier than before. She wiped down the counters, her movements slow and methodical, the rag in her hand moving in circles until the formica shone. When her shift finally ended, she changed out of her yellow dress and into her jeans and a simple sweater, the uniform feeling like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. The walk to the bus stop was always a transition. The noise of the diner faded, replaced by the sounds of the city. Cars honked, sirens wailed in the distance, and 1,000 conversations blended into a low, constant hum. She kept her head down, her hands tucked into her pockets, and let the current of people carry her forward. She felt invisible, just another face in the crowd, and sometimes that was a comfort. No one expected anything from her. No one needed her to smile. Her apartment building was a tired old brick thing, tucked away on a side street that the city seemed to have forgotten. The hallway smelled of dust and old cooking, and the fluorescent lights on the ceiling flickered, casting long dancing shadows. She unlocked her door with a key that was smooth and worn from years of use. The first thing she always did was listen. For a moment, there was only silence. Then she heard a soft, rasping cough from the bedroom down the hall. She quietly dropped her bag on the small table in the kitchenette and went to her mother's room. The door was slightly ajar. She peeked inside. Her mother was asleep in bed, her breathing shallow and uneven. A glass of water and a small plastic pill organizer sat on the nightstand. Ilara stood there for a long moment, just watching the gentle rise and fall of the blanket. The weight of responsibility settled on her, heavier than any tray of food she had ever carried. This was why she did it. This was why the ache in her feet and the weariness in her soul didn't matter. In the main room, she moved with a quiet efficiency. She made herself a small bowl of instant noodles, the steam warming her face as she stood over the stove. She ate standing up, leaning against the counter, her eyes drifting around the small space. The furniture was sparse: a second-hand couch, a wobbly table, 2 chairs. There were no decorations on the walls, no photos on the shelves. It was a place for sleeping and eating, not for living. And then her eyes fell on it. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden by a tall stack of old newspapers, was an electronic keyboard. It was an old model, its plastic casing yellowed with age. A thin layer of dust covered its black and white keys, and the power cord was frayed in one place, wrapped carefully with electrical tape. It was a relic from a different life, a life she had almost forgotten. A life before the diner, before the medical bills, before the world had narrowed to the size of a paycheck. Most nights she was too tired to even look at it. The thought of playing felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But tonight, something was different. The story of the excited teenager she had served at the diner was still echoing in her mind. It was a spark of hope in a world that often felt hopeless. She finished her noodles and put the bowl in the sink. Then slowly, as if approaching a sleeping animal, she walked over to the keyboard. She ran her finger along the dust cover, feeling the texture of the fabric. With a deep breath, she pulled it off. The air around it seemed to stir, as if waking something up that had been dormant for a long time. She sat down on the small, hard bench that came with it. The keys felt cool and smooth under her fingertips. For a moment, her hands just rested there, stiff and sore from a day of carrying plates. They felt clumsy, foreign. She wiggled her fingers, trying to loosen them up. She thought about the bills on the table, the rent that was due, the medicine her mother needed. The music felt like a foolish dream, a child's fantasy. But then, she closed her eyes. She took another breath, this one deeper than the last, and she began to play. It wasn't a song you would hear on the radio. It wasn't a classical piece from a dusty book. It was a melody that was born from the city itself. It started with a few simple, lonely notes, like the sound of a single car driving down an empty street late at night. Then, it began to grow. Her fingers, which had felt so clumsy just moments before, suddenly knew exactly where to go. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible, a fluid, effortless dance across the keys. The melody was full of contrasts. There were parts that were fast and frantic, like the morning rush at the diner, 1,000 notes coming at you all at once. There were parts that were slow and sad, like the sound of her mother's cough in the quiet of the apartment. There were notes that were high and bright, like the teenager's laugh, and notes that were low and deep, like the rumble of the bus on its way home. She wasn't thinking about the keys or the notes. She was just feeling. She was pouring all the stories she had collected, all the emotions she had kept locked away, into the music. The ache in her feet, the weariness in her soul, the love for her mother, the flicker of a dream she refused to let die was all there. In the haunting, beautiful melody that filled the small, quiet room. For a few precious minutes, she was not a poor waitress. She was not a tired daughter. She was just a musician, and the world outside her door, with all its worries and its demands, simply ceased to exist. The music was her escape, her sanctuary, her one true voice. And as the last note faded into the silence, she opened her eyes, and for the first time all day, her smile was real. The call came on a Tuesday, a day that smelled like rain and burnt toast. It was the catering company she sometimes worked for on her days off from the diner. The voice on the other end was quick and professional, offering a job for a private event. The pay was more than she made in 3 days at the diner. It was an easy yes. The extra money would mean she could buy her mother's medicine without having to skip a payment on the electricity bill. It was a small relief, a temporary patch on a sinking boat. But it was something. The day of the event, she joined a small crew of other temporary workers. They gathered in a sterile kitchen, a world away from the greasy, chaotic warmth of Gus's diner. Here, everything was stainless steel and sharp angles. They were given crisp, black uniforms and a list of strict instructions. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact with the guests. Move through the house like a shadow. Ilara felt the stiff fabric of the uniform, a stark contrast to her soft, faded yellow dress. Here, she wasn't Hun. She was a number, a pair of hands to carry a tray. A large, unmarked van drove them deep into the hills. Away from the cramped streets and noisy apartment buildings she knew, the roads got wider and smoother, lined with trees that seemed older and more dignified than the people in the city. Finally, they turned through a set of heavy iron gates that opened silently, as if by magic, and drove up a long, winding driveway. And then she saw it. The house wasn't a house. It was a statement. It was built of glass, steel, and pale stone, perched on the edge of the hill like a modern-day castle. It had sharp, clean lines and huge windows that looked out over the entire city, which now looked like a carpet of tiny, glittering lights. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was also cold. It didn't look like a place where people lived and laughed and made messes. It looked like a place where you would be afraid to touch anything. Inside, the feeling of being in a different world only grew stronger. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon and something expensive, a scent she couldn't name. The floors were polished concrete, so clean she could see her reflection in them. The walls were mostly bare, with a few large, abstract paintings that looked like splashes of color on a giant canvas. The furniture was minimalist and white, arranged in perfect geometric patterns. It was less like a home and more like a museum. Ilara felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness. She was sure there was a small, invisible smudge on her uniform, a stray hair on her shoulder. In this perfect world, any imperfection stood out. The guests began to arrive. They were just as polished as the house. The men wore sharp suits and expensive watches. The women were in dresses that looked like they had been made from liquid silk, their jewelry sparkling under the carefully placed spotlights. They moved with an easy confidence, holding glasses of champagne and laughing in loud musical voices. Ilara and the other staff moved among them, invisible and silent, offering trays of tiny, complicated foods on little sticks. She heard snippets of their conversations, talk of stock markets, art auctions, and vacations on private islands. It was a language she didn't speak, a world so far removed from her own that it might as well have been on another planet. And then she saw him. He was standing near the giant window that overlooked the city, a glass of something amber in his hand. This was Julian Vance, the host. He was tall and thin, with dark hair that was perfectly styled. His suit was tailored to his body, fitting him like a second skin. He smiled as a guest spoke to him, nodding politely, but his eyes seemed distant.
Ass!
As if he were looking right through the person and out at the city lights. He had the look of a man who had everything, yet looked utterly bored by it all. He was the king of this beautiful empty castle, and he seemed just as trapped as anyone. Ilara watched him as she worked. She saw him glide from one group of people to another, his smile never changing, his words always smooth and charming. But there was no warmth in him. It was a performance. He was playing the part of the gracious host, but his heart wasn't in it. She recognized the look in his eyes because she saw it in the mirror sometimes, after a long, hard day. It was the look of pure, deep exhaustion. But hers was from working too hard. His seemed to come from not having to work at all. As the evening went on, the noise level in the room grew. The laughter became louder, the voices more confident. It was the sound of people enjoying themselves. But it felt hollow to Ilara. It was like the sparkle of costume jewelry, bright from a distance, but cheap up close. She felt a strange sense of pity for these people. They had everything she thought she wanted: money, security, beautiful things, but they didn't seem to have any real joy. They were all performing just like their hosts, and then she saw it. In the middle of the grand room, sitting on a small raised platform, was a grand piano. It was a sleek black Steinway, its surface so polished it reflected the lights in the faces of the guests like a dark mirror. It was a magnificent instrument, a work of art that probably cost more than her apartment building. But it was silent. It sat there, majestic and ignored, while the room filled with the empty noise of conversations and clinking glasses. It was the most beautiful, lonely thing she had ever seen. Throughout the night, her eyes kept drifting back to it. She watched as people walked past it, not even giving it a second glance. A woman rested her empty champagne glass on it for a moment, leaving a wet ring on the perfect finish. A group of men stood next to it, laughing loudly, their backs turned to it as if it were just another piece of furniture. Each time, Alara felt a little sting, like a personal insult. She knew what that piano could do. She knew the voice it had, the stories it could tell, if only someone would let it speak. It was just like her, sitting in the corner of her small apartment, full of music that no one ever heard. Slowly, the party began to wind down. The guests started to leave, their goodbyes echoing in the large space. The noise faded, replaced by the quiet, methodical sounds of the cleaning crew. Alara was given the task of wiping down all the surfaces and collecting the forgotten glasses. She worked her way around the room, her movements quiet and efficient. And soon, she found herself standing right in front of the piano. The room was now almost empty. The last of the guests had gone, and the other staff members were busy in the kitchen. Julian Vance was nowhere to be seen. She was alone with it. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of a party that was trying too hard. It was a deep, peaceful silence. And in that silence, the piano seemed to call to her. It was more than just a desire. It was a physical pull, a magnetic force that drew her closer. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a drum against her ribs. She knew she shouldn't. She knew the rules. But looking at the beautiful, silent instrument, she felt like she was looking at a caged bird, and she was the only one who had the key. The silence in the grand room was a living thing. It pressed in on Alara from all sides, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the distant, muffled clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the frantic, shallow beating of her own heart. She finished wiping the last of the tables, her movements slow and deliberate, as if moving through water. But her eyes kept drifting back to the piano. It sat there in the center of the room, a dark, elegant shape in the dim light. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a challenge. It was a temptation. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to walk away. Her job, the money, her mother's medicine, it all depended on her being invisible, on following the rules. Touching the piano was the one thing she was absolutely not supposed to do. It would be so easy to just turn around, go back to the kitchen, and collect her pay. But her feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. The piano seemed to be calling her name, not with words, but with a deep, silent hum that only she could feel. She took a hesitant step closer, then another. It was like walking to the edge of a cliff. The polished black surface of the Steinway reflected the city lights from the window, making it look like a piece of the night sky had fallen into the room. She saw her own face in the reflection, a pale, ghostly image looking back at her. She looked tired. She looked scared. But she also looked curious. Her hand trembled as she reached out. She didn't plan to play it. She just wanted to feel it, to connect with this beautiful, silent thing. Her fingers hovered over the cool, smooth wood, and then gently she let them rest on the lid. A small, almost invisible circle of condensation from a guest's glass was there. Without thinking, she rubbed it away with the sleeve of her uniform, leaving a dark smudge-free streak. It was a small, intimate act, a quiet gesture of care. That small act broke the dam. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now it was mixed with a powerful, overwhelming desire. What if no one ever knew? What if this was her only chance to touch a dream, to feel what it was like to play an instrument that was made for a concert hall, not a dusty corner? The thought was dangerous. Siren's call, promising a moment of beauty at the cost of everything. She took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. She pulled out the small, adjustable bench. It was heavier than it looked, and the leather was soft and supple under her fingers. Sitting down on it felt like a surrender. She was no longer a waitress in a stiff black uniform. She was just a person at a piano. The keys in front of her were a landscape of white and black, a world of possibilities. They were pristine, perfect, and waiting. Her hands hovered over them, just above the ivory. They were the same hands that had scrubbed floors and carried heavy trays, the same hands that were tired and sore. But as they floated over the keys, they felt different. They felt like they remembered something important, something they were born to do. For a long moment, she just sat there, her eyes closed, listening to the silence, letting the fear and the desire fight it out inside her, and then desire won her right index finger, trembling slightly, came down gently on a single key in the middle of the keyboard. The note that came out was soft and clear, a perfect C that hung in the air like a single shimmering star. It was a small sound, but in the vast silent room it was everything. It was the first crack in the sterile silence, the first word in a long, quiet conversation. The sound was so pure, so full of life, that it made her want to cry. She didn't look around. She didn't listen for footsteps. She was lost. The single note had pulled her in, and now there was no going back. Her other fingers joined in, not playing a song she knew, but a feeling she felt. It was one of her own melodies, the one she called Asphalt Lullaby. It started with a few simple, lonely notes, like the sound of raindrops on a window pane late at night. It was the sound of her walk home from the bus stop. The feeling of being alone in a big city. Her fingers began to move with more confidence. The melody grew, weaving in the stories she had collected all day. There was a frantic, hurried passage that sounded like the morning rush at the diner. 100 notes coming at you at once, full of chaos and energy. Then it softened into a sad, gentle harmony that was the sound of her mother's quiet breathing. A melody full of love and worry. She was no longer thinking. She was just feeling. The music was pouring out of her, a river of sound that had been dammed up for too long. Her left hand added a deep, resonant bass line, the rumble of the city bus, the steady heartbeat of the world she lived in. Her right hand danced on the higher keys, playing notes that were bright and full of hope, like the laugh of the teenager who had gotten into college, a reminder that even in the darkness, there was light. The music was not technically perfect. There were a few hesitations, a couple of notes that were slightly off, but it didn't matter. It was honest. It was real. It was the sound of a human soul laid bare, with all its scars and its dreams. The grand piano, which had been a silent, lonely monument all night, was finally alive. Its voice filled the room, pushing against the glass walls and soaring up to the high ceiling. It was a voice that spoke of exhaustion and resilience, of poverty and hope, of a world that was harsh but still beautiful as she played. The world outside the music disappeared. The sterile mansion, the rich guests, the rules, the fear, it all faded away. There was only her and the piano. She was pouring all of herself into the music, all the things she could never say out loud. The ache in her feet, the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, the secret dream she kept locked in her heart, it was all there, in the haunting. Beautiful melody that filled the room. The song reached its peak. A crescendo of sound that was both powerful and fragile, like a bird soaring in a storm. It was the sound of her own spirit, refusing to be broken. And then slowly, gently, it began to fade. The notes became softer, the melody simpler, until it was back to that single, lonely note, like the one she had started with. She held it for a long moment, letting it hang in the air, a final, perfect sound in the silence. And then she let it go. The final note faded, and the silence rushed back in to fill the space it left behind. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer empty or sterile. It was full of the echo of the music, full of the emotions that had just been poured into it. The spell was broken. Elara's eyes snapped open. The reality of what she had just done crashed down on her like a physical blow. Her heart was pounding against her ribs, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. A cold wave of panic washed over her. She had done it. She had broken the biggest rule. She had touched the Millionaire's piano. She jumped up from the bench, her hands shaking, her mind racing with the consequences. She had to get out of there. She had to disappear before anyone found out. She turned to run, ready to flee back to the safety of the kitchen, but as she did, she saw a movement in the shadows of the hallway, and her blood ran cold. The figure in the shadows didn't move at first. It was just a shape, a darker part of the darkness in the hallway, and for a terrifying second, Elara wondered if she was just seeing things. If her fear had created a ghost, but then the shape shifted, and a man stepped out into the dim light of the main room. It was him. It was Julian Vance, the host, the owner of this beautiful, cold house. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore, and his tie was loosened. He looked less like a polished host and more like just a man standing in the quiet of his own empty home. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through Ilara's body. Her blood turned to ice. Every muscle in her body tensed, ready to run. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. She would be fired, of course. Worse, she might be in real trouble. She had trespassed, not just into a room, but into a world that was not meant for her. Her mind raced, trying to find the right words, the perfect apology that might undo what she had done. But her throat was tight and no words would come out. She could only stand there, frozen, like a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar. Except the cookie jar was a priceless Steinway piano, and the consequences felt infinitely more severe. She opened her mouth, but all that came out was a small, choked sound. "I'm so sorry," she finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean... I'll go." She took a step back, her hands held up in front of her as if to surrender. She couldn't meet his eyes. She just stared at the polished floor, at the reflection of the city lights that seemed to mock her. She felt small and foolish, a dusty speck in this perfect, gleaming world. She braced herself for the anger, the shouting. The cold dismissal she was sure was coming, but it didn't come. There was only silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Ilara risked a quick glance up at him. His face was impossible to read. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even annoyed. He was just looking at her, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. He took a slow step forward, then another, until he was standing just a few feet away from her. He wasn't looking at her uniform or her scared face. He was looking at the piano. "What was that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, softer than she expected. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, filled with a curiosity that completely threw her off balance. She had been prepared for anger, for punishment, but not for this. "It was nothing," she stammered, shaking her head. "Just a silly tune." "I'm so sorry, sir. I know I wasn't supposed to touch it. It won't happen again. I'll leave now." She turned to flee, desperate to escape the suffocating tension of the moment. "Wait," he said. The single word stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't a command. It was a request. She slowly turned back to face him, her heart still hammering against her ribs. He gestured toward the piano bench. "Play it again." Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. Play it again. Was this a test? Was he making fun of her? She searched his face for any sign of a trick, any hint of cruelty, but she found none. There was only a deep, quiet sincerity in his eyes. He looked like a man who was truly lost in the memory of the music he had just heard. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I want to hear it again, he said, his voice still soft. Please. The word please was so unexpected, so disarming, that it broke through her wall of fear. No one had ever said please to her in that way before. It wasn't the polite please of a customer ordering coffee. It was the please of someone who truly needed something. Hesitantly, she walked back to the piano. Her legs felt weak, like they might give out from under her. She sat down on the bench, the leather feeling cool against her skin. This time, it was different. She wasn't alone. She was being watched. The secret was out. The music was no longer just for her. She felt a new kind of pressure, fear that she wouldn't be able to recapture the magic of the first time. Julian didn't stand over her like a judge. He walked over to a nearby chair and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, giving her his full attention. He wasn't the Millionaire host anymore. He was just an audience of one, and he was listening. Ilara placed her trembling fingers on the keys. She took a deep, shaky breath and began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, unsure of themselves. But then, as the melody began to take shape, something changed. She looked up and saw the expression on his face. His eyes were closed, and he was completely lost in the music. He wasn't just hearing the notes. He was feeling them. Seeing his reaction, a new kind of courage flowed through her. She played the song with even more feeling than the first time. It was no longer a secret confession. It was a shared story. She put all of her fear, her hope, her exhaustion, and her dreams into the music. She played for the tired waitress in the yellow dress, for the sick mother in the next room, and for the lonely man in the empty mansion. The melody filled the room, and this time, it wasn't just breaking the silence. It was filling the silence, giving it a purpose and a soul. When the last note faded, she didn't jump up this time. She just sat there, her hands resting on the keys, listening to the echo of the music as it disappeared into the air. The silence that returned was not empty or awkward. It was a shared silence, full of the memory of what had just been created. Julian slowly opened his eyes. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the piano, then at her. There was a new light in his eyes, a flicker of something that had been missing before. "I used to play," he said, his voice quiet, almost a confession. "A long time ago, before all this." He gestured vaguely around the room, at the glass and the steel and the perfect empty space. "I forgot what it felt like. To make something that wasn't a spreadsheet. To feel something that wasn't a profit margin." He stood up and walked over to the piano. He didn't touch it. He just stood beside it, looking down at the keys as if they were old friends he hadn't seen in years. "That music," he said, turning to look at her. "It shouldn't be locked away. It shouldn't be played for an empty room." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What's your name?" "Ilara," she said, her voice still soft. "Ilara," he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "That music needs to be heard, Ilara, not just by me, by everyone." He looked at her, not as a waitress who had broken a rule, but as an artist who had just shown him a masterpiece. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to figure that out, together." Ilara looked at him, her mind reeling. This was not the ending she had expected. This was not a punishment. This was a beginning. She didn't know what he meant, or how he could possibly help her. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something bright and warm inside her chest. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope, and in the quiet of the grand empty mansion, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. The ride home in the catering van was silent. Ilara sat in the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The crisp business card Julian had given her feeling like a foreign object in her pocket. It was heavy with the possibility she couldn't quite grasp. The other workers talked and laughed, unwinding after a long night, but their voices were just background noise. She was lost in the echo of the music and the quiet, intense look in the millionaire's eyes. Was it real? Had it actually happened? It felt like a dream. A strange and beautiful fantasy that would disappear the moment she stepped back into her small, tired apartment. When the van dropped her off, she walked the familiar streets in a daze, the city lights blurring into a watercolor painting. The key turning in her lock was the only thing that felt real. Inside, the air was thick with the familiar scent of her mother's medicine. She peeked into the bedroom, saw the steady rise and fall of the blanket, and the world snapped back into focus. This was her reality. The piano, the mansion, the promise it, was all a world away. But the next afternoon, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Ilara, it's Julian Vance." The sound of his voice, calm and clear on the other end of the line, made it all terrifyingly real. Hello," she stammered. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "I've been thinking about your music. I have a proposition. I'd like to help you record a proper demo. Just a few songs in a professional studio. No pressure, no obligations. Just to capture what you do." Ilara was speechless. A studio? She had only ever seen them in movies. I don't have any money," she finally said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He chuckled softly. "That's not what this is about. This is an investment. In art, I'll handle everything. I can send a car for you tomorrow afternoon if you're free." She should have said no. It was too much. too strange. But the thought of hearing her music, her asphalt lullaby, played back on professional equipment, was a temptation too powerful to resist. "Okay," she whispered. "Yes, I'm free." The studio was nothing like she imagined. It wasn't a glamorous, star-studded place. It was a small, cozy building tucked away in an industrial part of town, but inside, it was a world of sound. There were thick carpets on the floor and strange foam-like shapes on the walls. In the center of the main room sat a beautiful grand piano, similar to the one at Julian's house, but with a warmer, more lived-in feel. A sound engineer with a long beard and a friendly smile introduced himself as Leo. At first, he looked at her with a polite professional indifference. But when she sat down and played the first few notes of her song, his expression changed. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes widening with surprise and then with genuine respect. Julian was there, but he didn't hover. He didn't try to direct her or give her notes. He just sat in the control room with Leo, listening. He was a quiet, supportive presence, a guardian of the space he had created for her. As Ilara played, she felt a new kind of freedom. She wasn't playing for a job or to escape her life. She was just playing. She poured everything into the keys, all the hope and fear that had been building up since the night before. When she finished, Leo's voice came through the speakers, filled with awe. "Okay," he said. "Let's do that again. And this time, let's make it magic." Hearing her own music played back through the high-quality studio monitors was a revelation. It was like hearing her own soul for the first time, clear and strong and beautiful. A few weeks later, Ilara stood in the diner, her uniform in her hand. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon was the same, but everything felt different. Gus was at the grill, his back to her. She walked over and placed the folded yellow dress on the counter. "I'm quitting, Gus," she said, her voice steady. He turned around, his gruff expression softening for a moment. He looked at the uniform, then at her. He didn't ask why. He just nodded slowly. "Figured as much," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "You're too good for this place, kid. Go on. Get out of here." He turned back to the grill, but she thought she saw a small smile on his face. Walking out of the diner for the last time wasn't sad. It felt like stepping into the sunlight. The months that followed were a blur of activity and change. Julian didn't just give her a recording. He gave her a foundation. He connected her with a music teacher who helped her refine her technique, not to change her style, but to give her more tools to express it. He helped her find a small, one-room apartment with a proper keyboard and good soundproofing so she could practice without waking her mother, who was now getting the best care money could buy. Ilara's life was no longer about survival. It was about music. She spent her days writing new melodies, her fingers flying across the keys, her heart full of a joy she had never known. And something was changing in Julian, too. He started spending less time at his office and more time at home. He would often have Ilara over to play just for him. The grand piano in his living room was no longer a silent monument. It was alive. Sometimes he would sit next to her on the bench, and she would teach him a simple melody she had written. His fingers, which had been used to typing on keyboards and signing checks, were relearning the language of music. The cold, empty mansion was slowly filling with warmth and sound. He was smiling more, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He was rediscovering a part of himself he had lost long ago. The story ended, as it began, with a piano. But this time, it wasn't in a mansion or a small apartment. It was on a small stage in a dim, smoky jazz club downtown. The room was packed, but it was an intimate crowd, a mix of old-timers and young music lovers. A simple, handwritten sign on a stand outside read tonight, "Ilara." She sat at the piano, the lights warm on her face. She was wearing a simple blue dress, not a uniform. She looked out at the crowd, her heart beating a familiar rhythm, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement. She took a deep breath and began to play. It was Asphalt Lullaby, the song that had started it all. But it was different now. It was stronger, more confident, filled with the journey she had taken in the back of the room. At a small table in the shadows, Julian Vance sat with a glass of whiskey. He watched her on the stage, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the spotlight. He saw the way her eyes closed as she played, the way she lost herself in the music. He saw the audience, captivated, silent, hanging on her every note. A quiet peace settled over him, a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been missing his entire life. He had set out to change her life, but in doing so, she had changed his. The piano in his house was no longer silent, and neither was the music in his own heart. As the final note of her song faded into the warm, appreciative applause of the club, he raised his glass in a silent toast. To the music, to the dream, and to the poor waitress who taught a millionaire how to feel alive again,